Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all delegates and participants from across the world who are present in Bali today. It is a privilege for me to host the 7th International Congress under the theme Getting Smart on Justice, Healing Hurt, and Safer Societies. The theme is not only compelling from academic perspective, but also highly relevant to the term of public policy is invited to rethink the relationship between justice, recovery, reintegration, and public safety as a cohesive unit. This theme also carries a very important message. In the 21st century, justice can no longer be understood merely as the state's ability to impose punishment. The state's capability to strike a balance between accountability, protecting victims, ensuring public safety, respecting human dignity, and responsibility for rehabilitation for those who have offended is a further aspect of justice. In other words, smart justice is not only really in normative sense, but also mature, ethically clear, and socially reasonable. I stand here before you today as the Senior Minister for Law, Human Rights, Immigration, and Corrections of the Republic of Indonesia. This is not a position confined a single technical sectors under our constitutional and governmental framework. It is the position responsible for synchronizing and coordinating the implementation of government affairs in the areas of law, human rights, immigration, and corrections, including inter-ministerial and inter-government bodies coordination. The respective I will present this evening is one of policy architecture, examining how probation and parole fit into modern rule of law framework that prioritize human dignity, public safety, and effective justice governance. In a forum such as this, my role is certainly not set out technical operational details that fall within the authority of implementing agencies on the ground. My task is to situate the discussions within broader context, encompassing the trajectory of the legal system reform, the state effort to balance law enforcement with the human rights, the development of cross-sectoral coordination that move beyond rhetoric, and Indonesia's approach to incorporating probation, parole, and community-based corrections into rational and law-governed state framework. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, this forum matters precisely because today's world is facing realities that are far from simple. On the one hand, societies worldwide demand the state to be firm in addressing crime, responsive to victims, and capable of maintaining public order. However, there is growing recognition that criminal justice systems that rely almost exclusively on imprisonment do not always deliver better justice, reduce recidivism, and strengthens public safety in long run. Consequently, many countries have begun reassessing their views on punishment, rehabilitation, and reintegration. This development suggests that the central questions in contemporary criminal justice is no longer simply now the state punishes, but how it wisely punishes. The issue is no longer merely how the state demonstrates its authority, how that authority is exercised rationally, proportionally, and in a manner that can be justified. It is, at this point, probation, parole, and various forms of community correction require even more compelling relevance. Therefore, I consider that probation and parole are not peripheral instruments within justice system. In fact, they are among the measures of maturity. A mature state is not one that only knows now to penalize, but on that also know how to exercise firmness while serving justice, directing criminal responsibility to punish, correct, restore, and rehabilitate individuals to become responsible members of society again. The notion of stresses because public discourse is often constrained by overly simplistic binary oppositions, implying a choice between permanence and compassion, public security and rehabilitation, justice for the victims, and the second chance for perpetrators. I argue that the mature and modern law-governed state must move beyond false opposition. It must be able to design a system that is firm without being brutal, human without being naive, and open to reintegration by remaining disciplined in supervision and accountability. In Indonesia, this perspective doesn't emerge in a vacuum. Our national development agenda under 2025-2029 National Medium-Term Development Plan placed the establishment of transparent, fair, and impartial rule of law among its central objectives. This means that the legal reform must not be understood merely as procedural reform, let alone as a mere addition or new regulation. Legal reform must enhance the quality of the rule of law, governance, and human dignity protection in public life. In a sense, the legal reform is concerned not only with the text of the statute, but also with institutional ethos. It concerns how officials work, how citizens experience justice, how victims are treated, how data are used, how discretion is exercised, and how the success of public policy is measured. A country can have numerous laws and regulations, but if they are not complemented by the strong moral compass and effective institutional collaboration, they may be ineffective. Corrections hold a strategic position within the criminal law. Law number 22 of 2022 affirmed that the correctional system is a comprehensive framework for managing detainees, juveniles, and inmates, conducted throughout services, rehabilitation, community guidance, care, security, and monitoring. Within this system, community guidance officers play a central role in conducting assessment, providing support, providing guidance, and supervising clients. Therefore, community guidance is not merely an add-on to punishment, it is an inherent part of the correctional system itself. However, current realities present significantly challenges. The total numbers of inmates has reached more than 270,000, comprising 215,000 convicted prisoners and 56,000 detainees, far exceeding the official capacity of only 150,000. This represents an overcrowding rate of the approximately 81%, resulting in congested facilities, high recidivism, and substantial social burdens. These conditions underscore the critical importance of correctional guidance. By making it a core component of the system, the law recognizes that punishment doesn't end with a verdict. A criminal sentence marks a crucial milestone, but it is not the final point. Ensuring that inmates are properly rehabilitated, risks are managed, relationships with family and society are restored. Behavior is guided constructively, and likelihood or reoffending is effectively minimized is equally important. Furthermore, Indonesia's national criminal law reforms is moving along the same path. The new criminal code, which came into force at the beginning of this year, emphasized the fusion of corrective, restorative, and rehabilitative justice. The new penal code proposes also encompass four orientations: preventing crime, reintegrating convicted persons through guidance, resolving conflict and restoring balance, and relieving the offender's sense of guilt. The underlying point of the significant is to highlight that probation, parole, supervision, and social reintegration are not novel concepts in Indonesian law, but rather align with the reform paradigm currently being developed. I wish to emphasize of this. Modern criminal law reform must change not only at the level of language, but also at the level of mindset. If the system orientation was previously overly simplistic, viewing punishment or retribution, we must now be willing to consider its purposes more broadly. The states must continue to uphold the norms. It must still be made clear that violations have consequences. However, the states must also recognize that a healthy social order is not built merely by imprisoning people, but it is also built by ensuring that those who have undergone legal process are given a sensible path back to responsible citizenships. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a civilization may ultimately be judged by its use of power. In a law-governed state, the power to punish is essential. Therefore, it must be limited by law, guided by rationally, and guarded by the principles of humanity. It is there that human rights acquire the deepest meaning. I do not see human rights standards as an additional burden upon the state, but as an ethical boundary that ensures the law enforcement does not lose its legitimacy. A strong law-governed state cannot act without restraint. On the contrary, it is the state knows how to exercise its authority in a measured manner. It doesn't treat human beings as objects. It is not assumes that all dignity is terribly lost because someone has violated the law. It continues to regard law as an instrument for ordering common life, not as a tool for erasing humanity. At the same time, I must stress that human justice is not weak justice. Intelligent justice is not equivalent to latent justice. Smart justice continues to uphold accountability. It continues to protect victims. It continues to safeguard the public. It allows the state to act firmly in the face of serious crime. However, it rejects simplistic thinking as though every social problem could be solved merely by expanding enforcement. Smart justice begins with a more fundamental question: do the instruments we choose genuinely strengthen social order, reduce the risk of reoffending, and enhance public safety? This is the crucial question for the policymakers. States may easily be tempted to choose policies that appear so on the surface but prove ineffective in the long term. However, one of the core tests of sound public policy is its capacity to address problems substantively, not merely symbolically. If a given instrument appears firm but fails to reduce recidivism, support reintegration, and build a public trust, then a primitive, more effective approach should be considered or integrated. Probation and parole must be seen as part of the public safety ecosystem, not as opposite. Many people still incorrectly perceive community-based approach as a form or leniency that weakens the law. It takes the opposite view. What matters is not whether a policy is labeled soft or hard, but the quality of its design. When assessment or strong criteria are well defined, supervision is expired, data and evaluations are accessible, and social support is sufficient, community-based correction can balance two objectives: safeguarding society and facilitating responsible reintegration. In other words, when the state makes room for probation and parole, it doesn't diminish its authority. Rather, it demonstrates maturity in policy. It shows that it is driven not merely by punitive instinct, but by a more developed institutional rationality. It is recognized that sustainable public policy requires more than confinement. It requires risk management, behavioral guidance, restoration, and social ties, and consistent policy coordination. Therefore, one of our major tasks moving forward is to strengthen the professions at the front line of the system. I wish to express my deepest appreciation to the community supervisors, probation officers, parole officers, and all who work at the platform for correction and reintegration. They work in an exceptionally complex field. They must assess risk, understand social background, connect law with the human reality, balance supervision with guidance, and often serve as bridge between the interests of the state, the family, and the society. In many respects, the success of all pillars of reintegration is especially determined by the quality of these professions. They are face of the state, present in the form of sanction and guidance. They must be capable of careful assessment, responsible recommendation, a sound understanding of family and social environment, and the ability to work under often intense public expectations. Therefore, genuine reform must include education, certification, professional ethics, supervision, and institutional capacity strengthening. I believe we all agree that no reform can succeed if those who implement it on the ground are left to work without adequate support. Yes, reform requires not only ideas but also professions. Reform requires norms, but it also requires people who are trained, trusted, and properly equipped. In this respect, human resources investment is not an additional cost. It is an essential condition if policy is not remain trapped on a paper. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, this Congress also raised the issue of technology and artificial intelligence. I consider this is an important issue. In the 21st century, criminal justice, correction, probation, and parole administration, which increasingly intersects with data system, digital platform, risk analytics, and limited form of automation. Technology can improve data accuracy, accelerate coordination, enhance service quality, and support more orderly decisions making. However, I wish to stress one principle that, in my view, must not be compromised. Technology must never replace the state's moral responsibility. Also, algorithms may assist They cannot replace the human judgment. Digital systems might accelerate processes, but they must not erode due process. Innovation may be embraced, but not at the expenses of transparency, non-discrimination, and respect for the human dignity. I wish to emphasize this point because we live in a time when technology is often treated as stroke. It were always natural and objective. Yes, technology is only as sound as the governance that surrounds its incomplete data can be misleading. Algorithms can multiply the bias. Accountable digital systems can distance citizens from decision-making processes that affect their life. Therefore, when technology enters the realms of law and corrections, the state must respond with care and not with fascination. This warning is important because justice system cannot operate through numbers alone. Justice operates through human beings. Data matters, empirical evidence is important. The outcome-based evaluation is important. However, human beings cannot be reduced entirely to risk scores, administrative categories, or statistical variables only. Therefore, sound reform must combine evidence with ethics, bringing technocratic precision and institutional wisdom together. In other words, technology must help the state become more just, not merely faster, more precise, yet also more responsible, more modern, but not colder. Without ethics, modernity can easily become injustice accelerated by the systems. Socioeconomic reintegration is another dimension that sometimes receives little attention. A person's former release from the correctional institutions does not necessarily mean that he or she has truly returned to normal social life. The real challenge often follows. Does the individual possess valid identification documents? Is he or she still accepted by their family? Is there access to education, employment, or meaningful activities? Is society willing to provide a second chance? If all these avenues remain inaccessible, then the state has merely relocated the issue from a confined institution to the broader community. Therefore, reintegration must be understood realistically, not sentimentally. It requires social conditions that make change possible. It requires family support, access to training, employment opportunities, social acceptance, proper administrative identity, and mental health support. Without this, a person who has formally completed his or her sentence may remain trapped in social powerlessness, and the risk of reoffending remain high. Reintegration cannot be viewed solely as a matter for one technical agency. It must become a cross-sectoral agenda. It includes education, vocational training, social protection, mental health, civil registration, local government, business sector, society organizations, and religious communities. Here, state coordinations become essential. It is also here that the role of a coordinating ministry acquires a practical significance to ensure that the reintegration agenda does not proceed in a fragmented way, but rather within one connected policy framework. Sectoral tendencies that often weaken outcomes must be overcome from a policy standpoint. One institution might focus on law enforcement, another on guidance, and another on social or employment services. All of these are important. However, if they are used in isolation, the result will remain limited. Successful reintegration always requires continuity. It requires bridge across sectors, policy leadership that is capable of seeing the whole is required, not merely the disconnected parts. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the public trust is one of the most important issues in contemporary correction policy and community correction. No matter how well regulations are drafted and how strong the academic argument behind them may be, policy will struggle to succeed if the public does not believe that the system operates fairly, measurably, and accountability. A clearer public explanation is therefore needed. Alternatives to imprisonment are not denial of justice, but a means of making justice work more rationally and effectively. We must be able to explain that reintegration is not a free gift, but part of a medium and long-term strategy for social security. Public trust is not born of rhetoric. It is born consistency. It is a result of procedural transparency, service quality, the state's ability to honestly explain public decisions, and willingness to evaluate itself. Public trust in the field of probation and parole will increase if people see assessment are conducted professionally, supervision is taken seriously, violations are dealt with firmly, and successful reintegration is regarded as a key indicator of policy success. Therefore, our task is not only to design a good policy, but also to build a public language capable of explaining why that policy is good. In a democracy, policy arguments must be answerable not only to the fellow expert, but also to the wider public. The more important a policy is for public safety in the public sense of the justice, the more important it is for the state to explain it openly to the public. Simultaneously, we must be humble enough to recognize that no model can simply be copied wholesale from one country to another. Each country has a unique history, legal culture, social structure, and institutional capacity. Therefore, the true value of international forum such as this is not to produce a single formula for the entire world, but to broaden the horizon of shared learning. We come to gatherings like this to test ideas, study experiences, and enrich principles that can be translated into each country's context. In that regard, I see international forums such as the WCPP as epistemic and policy dialogue space. Becomes not only to speak, but also to listen, not only to bring our own experience, but also to remain open to listen from everywhere. In an increasingly interconnected world, the quality of public policy is determined by our ability to learn across contexts without losing the sharpness with which we read our own national realities. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, hosting the Second World Congress of Probation and Parole carries special meaning for Indonesia. It is not merely a ceremonial honors. This is an opportunity to demonstrate that ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, can seriously and constructively contribute to the global discussion on criminal justice reform. This is also a chance for us to learn from the experiences of others while ensuring that the legal reform we pursue stay grounded in our constitutions, the values of the Pancasila, the state of philosophy of this country, the principles of democratic rule of law, and the respect for the human dignity. Pancasila is not only the philosophical foundation for the state, but also an ethical horizon for understanding the relationship between the state, society, and the human being. Commitment to humanity, social justice, deliberation, and civilized common life. Therefore, when Indonesia speaks of a legal reform, correction, and reintegration, we do not see them merely as administrative matters. We see them as a moral and constitutional responsibility to build a fair, safe, and human social order. In the host country, Indonesia now follows the path of previous Congress held in London, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Sydney, Ottawa, and The Hague. This shows that the Congress indeed the important forum in the global conversation on probation and parole. Hosting the event after that distinguished sequence of cities and certainly an honor, but it is also responsibility. The obligation is to make the meaningful contribution rather than simply attending, ensuring that this global conversation yield practical ideas, tangible cooperation, and lasting commitment is a responsibility. Allow me to add one final point, which is of great importance. Many justice discussions tend to focus on institutions, procedures, and norms. All of these points are undoubtedly important. However, beneath them all lies a more fundamental question. How does society regard those who have fallen? Are they seen only problems, or are they still seen as a person who must be held accountable yet retain the possibility of change? The moral quality of a country can be seen in how it answers the question. A major state is not naive about crime, nor cynical about change. It doesn't close its eye to the risk, nor does it shut every door to recovery. It understands that the public safety and human dignity must be designed together within a disciplined, rational, and sustainable policy framework. Therefore, I regard probation and parole as more than administrative mechanism following a judicial decision. The policies reflect a deeper philosophy of law, that the state can be firm yet retain its humanity, preserve public safety without losing its common sense, and uphold the law without foreclosing every possibility for a person to recover and reintegrate. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, we must not be romantic. Not every case is simple. Not every risk is small. Not every offender is ready to able to change quickly. Therefore, careful policy formulation, sharp assessment, discipline, supervision, and accountable governance are still required. However, such caution must not become a total refusal of reintegration. Vigilance must not become cynicism. Firmness should not become a moral deadlock. What we need is institutional wisdom that distinguishes between genuine and exaggerated threat, wisdom that knows when the state must detain, guide, and protect, and when it must reopen a path back. In my view, this kind of wisdom must become the soul of the smart justice. In conclusion, I will underline 3 points. First, a healthy justice system cannot be built merely by expanding the capacity to punish. It must also be constructed by enhancing the capability to guide, supervise, restore, and reintegrate. Second, human dignity and public safety are not two goals that cancel each other out. They must be designed together within a careful, proportionate, and accountable policy. Third, the reform of probation, parole, and correction in the 21st century must simultaneously stand on the three foundations: evidence, ethic, and coordination. Without evidence, policy becomes a slogan. Without ethic, policy loses legitimacy. Without coordination, policy fragments into sectoral fragmentation that weaken its own outcomes. Without public trust and moral courage, even well-intentioned policies will struggle to bring about the full intended impact, remaining mostly in the air rhetorics that fail to lead the tangible change. Therefore, today's task is not merely to improve system, but also to build the intellectual and institutional courage to determine justice in a more complete terms. I believe that if we sustain these three foundations, coupled with the commitment to professionalism, cross-sectoral coordination, and willingness to learn from one another's experience, then we will not only build more efficient system, we shall also build more just, institutionally mature, morally legitimate, and beneficial system for society. Finally, on behalf of the government of the Republic of Indonesia, I wish you all a successful and fruitful 7th World Congress on Probation and Parole 2026. May this forum produce honest exchange of ideas, meaningful cooperation, and a shared commitment to building justice that is smarter, more human, and better able to keep our society safe. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.